All right, guys, so we have another episode of Dune Prophecy to talk about, episode number 2, and this is going to be a full spoiler discussion. So if you guys have not seen episode 2 of Dune Prophecy, just make sure to come back later, save the segment for later, and come back and listen once you have, because we are going to be discussing Dune Prophecy episode 2 and all the spoiler details. So that's your final warning. I will say this about Dune Prophecy. As I said in the last episode, it is a show that is all about intrigue, right? It's all about, building up the characters, building up the storylines, all the different plots, all the different betrayals and things that are going on, all the intricacies that make up the show and make it, maybe less of an action kind of a show, and even less so than Penguin, which, it's in itself didn't have a ton of action in it, but it's more about the intrigue, it's more about the characters. And I think episode 2 really hits that home, right? This is a show that if you're not invested in what's going on, if you're not invested in the characters, or you're not invested in the stakes, then it's gonna not really matter that much to you. And I think that that's totally fair. We'll talk about who the show might be for at the end of this segment, but I think, until then, let's just kind of go through the episode, as I always do, kind of doing a play-by-play breakdown of, not breakdown, but, just sort of walking through the episode again, and then we'll talk about our thoughts at the very end, as we always do. So, as we start out here, the introduction, I don't think I remember this introduction sequence from episode 1. It might have been a new thing in the second episode, and I really like it. I think it's very, I know HBO did both Game of Thrones and Dune Prophecy, but it's very kind of Game of Thrones, where you're going through all the graphics, and you have this kind of creepy, ominous music, but it's kind of stirring, and I like this opening sequence. I don't know, it's evocative of that kind of Game of Thrones kind of vibe as well. And I know some people have been saying, not just in my comment section, but in other people's comment sections, of, oh, this is just basically ripping off Game of Thrones. Guys, you have to remember, and I don't blame you if you watched Game of Thrones first. I mean, obviously you watched Game of Thrones before, you might have watched Game of Thrones before Dune Prophecy, because Game of Thrones came out earlier. But if you're talking about just pure inspiration, Dune, right? Dune was one of the seminal science fiction pieces of literature. It is, it was written in the 1960s, I believe, and almost everything that came afterwards in the science fiction space, and I'm talking everything, including Star Wars and most definitely even parts of Game of Thrones, were based on Dune. I mean, Dune was first. So, I think it's totally fine to love both something like Game of Thrones and Dune and Dune Prophecy, but just to say that, Dune Prophecy is ripping off Game of Thrones, I mean, maybe fair in terms of the television, the writing and whatnot, but the storylines and the characters and what, all the houses and fighting and spice, it's all been there first. And so I just thought that was an interesting parallel to draw, especially given the way that the introduction, was coming out. But anyways, so then we get some space shots as we begin this episode, which I think, I have to say, I really like the space shots when they use them in the Dune franchise. I know that they don't use it that much, but I think that they're just, I don't know, they're really cool. They look really cool. That's my, profound commentary on these space shots. So, but anyways, what's so interesting about this show is that it's being, set up as a murder mystery, at least in this episode, in this particular episode, it's being self-contained as a murder mystery, but who did the murders. And in fact, that kind of gets explored later on when, Desmond Hart gets interrogated, and he's like, nope, I totally did it. I'm the one who did it. And then it's less about who did it, because, within the Bene Gesserit school, people are like, you wonder who did it. And we're investigating this body of Kasha and trying to figure out how the murders happened. I think that's going to be the bigger question that I have going, from the end of this episode, is how was he able, how does Desmond have his powers? I think it's a big question that I have moving forward into the rest of the series. So I think that'll be something to keep an eye on as well. Also, this school for the Bene Gesserit, it reminds me, I'm not going to say based on or ripped off or inspiration or whatever. I'm just saying from my own experience of what I've seen, it reminds me very much of Star Wars, especially the prequel era Star Wars of Jedi. Valia telling Tula that emotions are clouding her judgment, and later on they say something else as well, about, I'll get to it in my notes, but there are a lot of allusions to just kind of trying to let your thoughts control you and your emotions, and I think that that's kind of interesting. It reminded me a lot of the Jedi Order in the prequel trilogy. So now we're setting up this thing here with this student named Lila and putting her through something called the Agony. And again, just like in episode 1, just like with any other Dune story, there's a lot of exposition, there's a lot of moving parts, there's a lot of new terms, and it's just something that we just kind of have to get on board with. And if not, then the series is not going to make a whole lot of sense. And so there is that. We head back to Seleucus Secundus and we head back to the palace, which I honestly think is where things were more interesting with Desmond Hart and with the boy Pruitt, and then obviously with Inez and Kira and Atreides, and there are a lot of really interesting things going on there. But also then, the Mother Superior, Emily Watson's character, also shows up there. So I think the palace is where a lot of interesting things are going on and going to happen as well. Although I'll be interested to see if Inez finally does show up to the Bene Gesserit school, and if that makes that storyline, feel a little bit more prescient. Although I suppose the Lila stuff that happens at the end makes the Bene Gesserit school a lot more interesting, given what happens there. But we will get to that at the end of this segment. So the Emperor's wife, as we move on into this next part of the episode, the Emperor's wife is being very cunning and very calculating, and it's her idea in the first place to use Desmond Hart to to attack their enemies and to manipulate him, or not manipulate him. I think he knows exactly what he's doing, but in order to just use him in her eyes to be a killing machine basically. And I think that's really creepy. And also the fact that she's blaming the burns of the son Pruitt, right? Ricchese to his own father. She's blaming it on the thinking machines, which I think she knows very well that that's not the case. But still, I mean, this character is also someone to keep an eye on. I think in the first episode she didn't really have a whole lot to do, but I think that moving forward, the Emperor's wife, I'm calling her the Emperor's wife because I'm just blanking on her name, but I think that she's going to be a character that's going to be very, 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 very interesting to follow moving forward. So then Desmond comes forward, and Desmond basically is trying to manipulate the Emperor by saying that he, that the Emperor was the one who wanted all of this to happen, and he was just following orders. Again, another part of this character that I think is super interesting. He is quickly becoming the most interesting character in this entire show, and I'm so curious to see more of his backstory and find out what happened on Arrakis and what's going on. I think that that'll probably be a whole episode, honestly, a whole flashback episode about what happened on Arrakis, and we will see there. Then, and my notes as well, this is the other Star Wars connection here, where the sisters, they take or at least they tell Lila, because I think after what happened to Lila at the end of this episode, there's a lot up in the air about what actually is true and what actually is not true. But at least they tell Lila that they take the sisters from birth, from their mothers. And so that's another kind of, it reminds me of, the Star Wars connection. So then we get some revelations about Lila, at least told from the perspective of Tula, that she is apparently the great-great-granddaughter of Rakella. And so, yeah, I mean, that's probably a shock to her if that was the first time she was realizing it. And that's why she has to go through the agony to then, convene and to talk with Rakella and talk about what is going on here. Because, it's called Dune prophecy, right? And the prophecy is about this whole reckoning that's going on here. And they just want to figure out what's going on. And they want to figure out what to do, I guess, how to solve it. And so that's why they want to talk to Rakella. Then we get some scenes with Constantine and Pruitt Ricchese's sister, I suppose. I'm not going to go into detail here. Like I've been saying, this is, this show in particular is not family friendly, but the Access Blockbusters Pod is family friendly. So just to say that, yeah, not family friendly stuff going on here. But I think the interesting thing is that later on, then what happens is that Constantine, who lets slip that Desmond Hart is being held in the palace, is that information is then given to the Duke Ricchese, and that is sort of the impetus for then threatening him later on with Desmond Hart. So I think that is also just part of the political intrigue, part of the political intrigue. So then Valia is like, well, I need to take matters into my own hands, as she should, because obviously Kasha died and also Pruitt died. And I think what she's seeing here, what's so interesting about this character is that she's seeing her whole world kind of crumble around her because her plans are just not coming to fruition. Obviously, she had this whole idyllic plan of getting Inez to come to the Bene Gesserit school, and then Inez was going to rise to the top, and all of that is crumbling before her very eyes. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see what Valia does in retaliation and how she handles it. Because also, as she confronts Desmond later on in the episode, I think even then, as he resists the voice, it's another wrench thrown in her plans. We're going to see what this character is really, really made of. But she leaves Theodosia with Inez, which I'm assuming is going to be a key character pairing later on in the show. And I'm very interested to see the interaction between those two characters, because I do like the character of Inez, and I want to know more about Theodosia. So we'll see if those two characters have anything going on there. Then Mother Superior interrogates Desmond. It's a really fascinating scene. They're going back and forth, trading jabs. She's trying to tell if he's lying. And it's really the question, right? The question is, how was Desmond able to commit that murder halfway across the universe? And I think that will be a big question that will be answered later on. So then we move on to Kieran Atreides, who is apparently a part of this kind of rebellion. He has this whole layout of the palace and part of a rebellion that, because I guess this is sort of a social commentary on the fact that the rich get richer on spice, because spice is basically the currency of this universe, this Dune universe, and it's all on Arrakis, which is what makes Arrakis so important to these characters. But yeah, the spice, the rich are hoarding the spice, and so it's going to be kind of a violent rebellion. So it's very interesting to see an Atreides being a part of this rebellion against the Emperor, because history repeats itself 10,000 years later, albeit, but still, history is repeating itself in a certain way. And I think, honestly, it was at this point, once we got introduced to this Kieran Atreides part of the show, that I realized that episode 2 is dealing with a lot of spinning plates. You have this whole Kieran Atreides rebellion subplot. You have the Desmond Hart big, I think I would call it the A plot of what he's up to and how he's able to commit these murders and what his motivations are. You also have this Lila thing that went on in this episode, at least. And then you have Inez. And so a lot of spinning plates. I think personally, for me, it's working. But I can totally understand as well, for somebody who is not invested in the show and for somebody who is not invested in the Dune universe, that this it's just not working as well. Because I think that for me, this is a show where if you don't like the show because it's either boring or just confusing or too dense or whatever, that is honestly totally understandable, because it's just not a show that is conducive to, being it's not something where you can just kind of turn your brain off. You kind of have to really lock in and figure out who these characters are and what their deal is. And I think that is just, it's part of, watching a Dune show. It really evokes the experience, honestly, of reading a Dune book. These books are dense. They're confusing at times. There's names everywhere. There's terms everywhere. But if you kind of get to the root of the story, the intrigue and the political the political intrigue rather, is really interesting. And I think that this show is actually encapsulating that vibe very, very well. So there is that. The Mother Superior then has this conversation with another sister of the Bene Gesserit, and they're talking about, empowering the Emperor, but also empowering the rebellion. They're trying to play this whole cat and mouse game. But I think that the point of this show is trying to show that, plans are not always going to work out here. And I think that she's slowly starting to realize that all of her plans are really crumbling before her very eyes, like we talked about before. So then the Emperor's wife goes and meets Desmond, and she is playing a very dangerous game by trying to use him to kill other people. Don't know how long that's gonna last, but we will see about that. We then flip back to Lila, and at first I thought that this Lila subplot was honestly the least interesting one. I was like, I don't know about this whole let's talk to my ancestors kind of thing. But then a lot of really interesting things happen. So, she goes into these visions, right? And she sees all these women around her. It's just creepy. It's so creepy because you see her surrounded by all these hooded figures, and it's like a horror scene basically. And she's getting this poison vision, and it's really creepy. So on top of the fact that it's important to the plot, it's also just really well shot and really creepily done. But then the story takes kind of a turn, because she sees the vision of the young Valia killing Dorothea, I guess. And is it revealed? I still have to figure this out, because I haven't gotten a straight answer about this. Is it revealed that she's actually not the great-granddaughter of Raquella, and is she related to Dorothea somehow? Like, is there a reason that she saw that vision instead? I wonder about that, because I don't know that's not a scene that Raquella would have seen. That happened right after Raquella died. And so I'm actually very curious now, because, Lila's dead, so we won't see that character again. But I'm actually very curious to see how that plays into everything that's going on. I think there's a lot more to Valia Harkonnen and the Harkonnen family that has yet to be revealed. I think that there were mentions that Tula made early on about all the secrets that they were keeping, and so I'd be very interested to see where that was going later. And then that ends a very trippy scene, and she dies, which is really scary. So yeah, and then we have one final confrontation here. I think this is a really great ending point for this episode, where Desmond confronts, Desmond confronts the Mother Superior and Valia Harkonnen, and she tries to use the voice, and she resists the voice, and Desmond reveals that his whole point, his purpose at least, is that he wants to wipe out all the Bene Gesserit, making him clearly the antagonist of the show that tracks. And now it just remains to be seen what is going to happen and why is that his mission and how is he able to do that? I think these are all intriguing questions. So guys, honestly, I've talked through this episode. I talked through episode 1. I get it, right? These episodes they're not groundbreaking television in the sense of I finish each episode and I go, that was just the best episode of television I've ever seen. That was groundbreaking storytelling. None of that, right? I think what these episodes are they're intricate, they're complex. Like I said, they mirror the experience of reading a Dune book very, very well. But I think that, if you're somebody who's like, I just don't care about these characters, I don't care about what's going on. Honestly, I totally get it. This show, these episodes are just not for everybody. For me personally, as somebody who is a big sci-fi fantasy person, who's, a big fan of the Dune books, honestly, at least Dune 1 and Dune Messiah, and who just loves mythology and who loves lore, and then who also loves political intrigue, it takes a while. You're trying to latch on to characters, you're trying to figure out what's going on. But I have honestly found the first 2 episodes to be a very interesting build. I think the first 2 episodes so far are building towards a really interesting story, but whether or not it pays off, I think will then cloud my view of these first 2 episodes significantly. But, I think that this show is still well made. I think the characters are interesting, and I think that the story that they're telling has a lot of potential. And so I'm excited to see where they go from there. But guys, let me know what you thought in the comments down below. But episode 2 of Dune Prophecy, did you like it better than episode 1? Let me know in the comments down below.